Good. Thank you very much, Professor Lindberg. It's really fascinating. And Professor Ono, may I ask your comments?
Yeah, thank you so much, Staffan. So this is more like a questions or things that I like to ask. So this is very impressive that we see that decay of democracy, like a declining of democracies, and many countries are getting autocratized. I'm I'm curious about why we see this trend, and I know it's difficult to speculate, but do you have any things that you speculate for the future trend? Like, do we see more autocratization, or we go back to the normal trend? I mean, the trend to that the many countries are going to be democratized. I'd like to hear about your opinion about the future prospect and the trend. And second thing I like to ask is about the V-Dem project. Could you talk a bit about a V-Dem project and the indices created from the V-Dem project? I think many people in Japan are interested in hearing and knowing about the V-Dem project. I think these indices are quite useful, not only research, but also when we think about policies and making policies in many other countries, and including Japan. So could you talk a bit about the V-Dem project? Thank you so much.
Professor Lindberg, could you answer?
Yes, thank you, Professor Ono. So let me start from the back then with the V-Dem project, perhaps, and move forward. The V-Dem project, we started it back in 2009-10, bringing together a large group of scholars that were experts on democracy and democratization and different parts of the world. And then we built up a network of what we call regional managers, professors in other countries, including in Japan. For East Asia is Professor Kazuya Yuko at Keio University. In the Philippines is Professor Julio Tejanque at De La Salle University, and so on. And then eventually a large network of now over 3,500 scholars and other experts that are our country experts we work with. So for about half of the 473 indicators that we measure are really sort of factual measures, if you like. They are sort of how many political parties do you have in parliament? What does the legislation say about the powers of the legislature to provide checks and balances and so on? But I think we all know that many things that we need to know about to what extent there is democracy in a country does not show in those factual indicators. We need to have the factual indicators, but they are not enough. For example, the legislature in Belarus or in the Philippines have the same powers of providing checks and balances over the executive as we do in Sweden. But the key question is, do they actually use it, right? Or take media freedom and say harassment of journalists. We could work with World Press Freedom Association and the Journalists Without Borders and count how many journalists are being harassed or thrown into jail or killed, like Putin used to do. And then we get a factual measure in the sense that we know exactly how many are killed or harassed. But that's not really a good measure, because that number is zero most of the time in Sweden, in a country like Sweden, hopefully in Japan as well. I wouldn't know, but I hope so. But it's also zero in North Korea, because nobody dares to stick out their neck. So you have empirical equivalence, and the factual measure would, for North Korea, would then make them look like they have perfect media freedom, because no journalists are being harassed. So what we really want to know is this: if a journalist criticizes the government, what's the probability, the likelihood that that journalist will be harassed or thrown into jail? Because that probability is about 100% in North Korea and close to zero in Sweden. And an increase and decrease will mean the same thing across contexts. So those are the two kinds of indicators where we need the evaluations of country experts. And so these 3,500 country experts on, say, political parties in Japan, civil society in Philippines, and so on, that we have validated their expertise, they are published in this area, and so on and so forth. So they are the ones that are helping us to code these sorts of indicators, and multiple experts for each indicator, and then very advanced statistical modeling to achieve across time and country, across country equivalence and measures. So this is something we've developed over now 10 years. And the data was first released in the public sphere in January 2016. And since then, we've done annual updates and started to produce these democracy reports as well. So it's an enormous international collaboration. And we at the V-Dem Institute at the University of Gothenburg is the headquarters for all this. But it's not me or anybody here, or as I used to say, no white person in his 50s, a white man in his 50s deciding how democratic Zambia is, or Ecuador, or Philippines, right? It's experts, and most of the experts are local in the sense they are academics in Japan, coding Japan, or academics in the Philippines or in Indonesia, coding, and so on. It's being used. Our data is used very widely now. The World Bank uses it all the time, the European Commission and European Union all the time, and we deliver data to them and analysis. USAID uses it to benchmark countries for their budget support, for example, and in their metrics of what they call roadmap to change stuff and so on. So a lot of international intergovernmental organizations are now using V-Dem data rather than Freedom House or Polity or any of the others. And individual countries, of course, and individual organizations, international NGOs like Article 19 on media freedom and so on. So I hope it can also be more widely used in Japan eventually. Now, with the future, we're both political scientists, and we don't like to speculate about the future, right? But just if we extrapolate these trends, and there's nothing, I mean, if we extrapolate these trends, it's just going to go down and get worse. And there's nothing to me that I see around in the world that's suggesting that this is going to turn around anytime soon. Right? And part of the reason is because we know this is not only with politics, but say economic development, or any other sort of worldwide global trend, when it starts to happening, and especially when it involves large and influential countries in the international sphere, we know that diffusion is no illusion. They tend to drag other countries with them, and we're starting to see that happening now, and that's really worrying. I'm sorry, but I cannot find very much to sort of suggest any kind of optimism in the near future, at least.
Okay, thank you, Professor Lindberg. Professor Ono, would you respond to his comment?
No, great. So yeah, actually, I'm serving as a country expert for like V-Dem. Like I'm a country expert in Japan, and helping coding, like creating indices for V-Dem. And I think those indices are quite useful. So I hope that the many social scientists in Japan also use those indices. And also, I totally agree about the trend of autocratization. So I agree that the trend seems like a pessimistic. Unfortunately, it's hard to expect that the trend change anytime soon. And even East Asian countries, we are observing rapid autocratization, like Hong Kong. So this is very concerning trend. And as a political scientist, I also don't know how we can change the autocratization. We still don't know why exactly, what causes autocratization, what causes many countries, many people pick autocracy rather than democracy. So yeah, this is very a worrying and concerning trend. Yeah. So yeah. Anything negative?
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Ono. We'd like to move on to the question and answer session. I have several questions from the floor, and yes, I'd like to pick up this one. It's very important, I believe. What is the value of democracy? And I read this according to the Alexis de Tocqueville's famous American Democracy says that democracy does not give its nation the most skillful administration, but it ensures what the most skillful administration is often too powerless to create, namely, to spread through the whole social community restless activity, an overabundant force, an energy which never exists without it, and which, however unfavorable the circumstances, can perform wonders. Therein lie its real advantage. Yes, according to this question, that the point of the democracy is, of course, the most important is the freedom of expression, the freedom of the freedom itself, but some kind of such kind of activity or the energy in society would be important, perhaps. So, would you have some comment about the value of democracy?
Oh, definitely. I think 3 points are important. First, democracy is the only known system we in a modern state that ensures human dignity by its very nature. Dignity in terms of having a say under the conditions you will live. So, and that leads to the second point, I think. Beyond democracy's intrinsic value in terms of providing this freedom and dignity for human beings, which I find very important myself. A bit beyond that, there is a lot, at least current again with countries like China trying to promote their model, and some people saying, well, it's better to have a sort of a good dictator, right? That can produce good things for the people. Now, good dictators can happen. It's happened, and in the sense of providing economic development. You have Singapore not far away, Korea before its democratization, and Taiwan as well, and so on. But they are very rare. If you look at the world history of autocracies, you're much more likely to end up like China under Mao, or DRC Congo. That's the modal outcome for dictatorships. And these sort of developmental dictatorships are very rare. And the problem is, of course, then that if you sort of bet on getting a good dictator and you lose, there's no way to change except maybe kill that person. So the peaceful exchange of leadership, you can throw the rascals out, as the saying goes. If you don't like what they're doing, is sort of the other second sort of advantage of democracy. Now, third, democracy has dividends. We have recently at the V-Dem Institute gathered sort of the most recent rigorous, really hardcore science in a number of areas. So non-political scientists mostly writing about and analyzing if democracy have dividends in terms of economic development. And there the evidence now is very clear. Democracies have on average higher growth rate than dictatorships. They also have much less susceptible to severe economic crisis. And severe economic crisis obviously is bad. And with all kinds of synthetic controls, studies, and so on, showing that countries that democratize, as Moglen and Robinson, for example, calculate that they after democratization have increased the GDP per capita growth by 20% compared to if they had not democratized. Also in the area of human health and human development, the evidence now is abundant and very clear. Democracies are much better at, say, lower infant mortality. Going from the worst dictatorship to the best type of democracy, on average, is associated with a 94% reduction in infant mortality. Life expectancy goes up when countries democratize, and when they autocratize, it goes down, and so on. The evidence there is also very clear. Then you have things like conflict, violent conflict. We know since long that democracies don't fight wars with each other, they can't end peace, holds. But also now evidence shows that with domestic conflict and sort of civil war and lower scale types of domestic violence, democracies again are much better. So again, their democracy has dividends. And also when it comes to climate change, which is big on the agenda, right? Latest studies have shown that democracies, if you look at the Paris Accord, their commitment to climate change mitigation is equal to a lowering of the climate change equivalent to 1.4 degrees. That's rather much, right? So again, if we're going to be able to do something about this climate change, then we need democracies. And this wave of autocratization then is going to mean worse climate change. It's going to mean more both domestic conflict and interstate wars. It's going to mean lower economic development. It's going to mean lower human development and more children dying as infants, more mothers dying, giving birth, more and lower life expectancy in general, and so on. So democracy is valuable for both its intrinsic reasons and for its ability to sort of correct when political leadership doesn't do sort of, or do really bad things at least, and on a host of important outcomes, democracy has dividends. So democracy is valuable in several ways.
Okay, thank you very much for your great comments. And this next question is what should we citizens do? I think it means that the other citizen, what kind of the point we should take care or the watch out the social phenomena or the leadership. So what is the point to the check as a citizen?
Well, thank you. I think for a country like Japan, that's obviously a democracy, and if you look at your domestic situation, and I'm not a specialist on Japan, but thinking in general about democracies, countries that are democracies now, it's very important to um, be aware that autocratization typically starts with attacks and undermining freedom of expression, especially the media. Um, the kinds of threats we are measuring mostly is our threats exercised by governments. But we also know that in today's world with social media and different types of extremist groups and conspiracy theories and all that, there are also threats coming from other quarters than the government. But it's often the first step. So that's really important to be vigilant about if and when there are threats to freedom of expression that start to materialize and seek to counter them and protect freedom of expression.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Ono, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, so like even in Japan, we often see attacks on media from like government or governing parties these days. So like so we are like currently like facing like a very fragile situation, and the like a populism, like a populist and a populism is not necessarily like striving in Japan yet, but many other countries, people like the voters are very enthusiastic. Like the case in the US, for example, many voters support populist politicians. Like this is very shocking, actually. Like why? Like many people are very enthusiastic about like support, like enthusiastically support populism and the populist candidates in elections. Yeah, and that, yeah, so yeah, the starting point comes from media. Like, yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, it's so we have to be very cautious about like this trend. And the part, maybe this is partly coming from like the internet, like SNS, like people, especially like the young people these days, do not, like in the case of Japan, for example, many young Japanese don't read newspapers, for example, but the media news consumption mostly coming from the sources in like unreliable sources on the internet, and that may cause so young people tend to be more like critical to the media, like saying that the mass media often distribute fake information, fake news to the public. So there is some trend, like we see like those movements in Japan. This is very concerning to me as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ono. And I think that it's time to the close. So, do you have any final comments to the Japanese audience, Professor Lindberg?
Yeah, it's very worrying to hear that the freedom of the media is also under some level of attack, also in Japan. I think that is something really to be concerned about and voice concerns about in the public sphere. It should be discussed. And I think on the final sort of food for thought I would send to you is that I think this goes also wider for say social media and the use of internet. I think we are facing a dilemma today that's sort of a parallel to what the world was facing after World War II. After World War II, especially in Europe, the experience with Nazism, the dilemma was how to constrain and regulate freedom of association to avoid parties like the Nazi Party in Germany and so on to form and exist, to preserve freedom of association, right? Restrict freedom of association in order to preserve it and guard it. I think we're facing the same dilemma now with freedom of expression. It needs to be regulated. It needs to be constrained on the internet, in social media, in order to protect it. And that's a very, very difficult dilemma, but it's something I think the world, we need to somehow figure out. I don't have the solution, but I think it's the real long-term threat to democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Ono, would you have some final comment? Okay. Professor Ono, you are mute.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much, Professor Lindberg. I enjoyed your presentation, and I would like to talk directly in Japan. Last year, we had a nice conversation in Tokyo, and I was hoping to invite Professor Lindberg to Japan this year, but unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 situation, I couldn't do that this time. But hopefully next year or sometime soon, I could invite you to Japan again to discuss more on this important issue. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Ono. Actually, in Japan, the punishment is threatened because of the some bullying incident in Japan by the SNS. So we have to take care of such kind of the move. And your activities with over 6 continents and 50 social scientists and 3,500 country experts, it's an amazing, great achievement. And I read the political scientist Daniel Hudbush, who described V-Dem as the most important provider of quantitative democratic data for academic research. Yes, as a research institute, we are very grateful to your contribution to the as a public goods provider. And I and Professor Yano, our chairman, is an economist, and economist knows that GDP is one of the best invention in the 20th centuries, because we can measure the economy. Now, according to your, thanks to your contribution, that we can measure the democracy, and if we can measure it, we can improve it. So, thank you very much for today's lecture and discussion, and we are hoping to meet you in Japan in the near future. Thank you. Okay, this concludes today's webinar, and thank you very much again for the Professor Lindberg and the Professor Ono for your excellent presentation and comments.